ultimately some kind of compromise would be struck where some sort of palatable fishing regulation would be made into law. As we are seeing now in many cases, these compromises in the form of regulation or policy have turned out ultimately to be insufficient to conserve the resource. Many fishing communities are emptying out as fish stocks are disappearing, and scientists estimate that the vast majority of the major fish stocks worldwide are in collapse. In this case, the regulatory process failed to protect the fish stocks from disaster and also failed to protect the fishing communities from eventually becoming obsolete. A scenario like this is outlined in an article published in 2008 in the Journal of Applied Ecology by 2 Dutch researchers about a particular case of cockle fishing in the Dutch Wadden Sea. Svart and Van Andel used their fishery case study to explore how scientific knowledge is produced in social and economic contexts. As they state, and I quote, "Ecological research that informs management practice cannot always be separated from political, judicial, economic, ethical, and public affairs." Svart and Van Andel highlighted how in such situations when scientists come up with results or recommendations that are socially or economically unpalatable, they often are accused of conducting poor science on the one hand or behaving like conservationists rather than independent scientists on the other hand. In some cases, scientists have been barred from doing research because of past positions or recommendations they have made. I see many parallels to this in the case of New Orleans. Many years of ecological research in Louisiana had resulted as early as the mid-1990s in the knowledge that coastal Louisiana was losing marshland at a rapid pace, and that this was making the coastlines and the cities of coastal Louisiana more vulnerable to flooding and hurricanes. In this case, it was industry and government, as opposed to the actual local communities, that objected to or ignored this information and the recommendations made by scientists. At the same time, we now know that whatever flood protection was actually being built would turn out, in the case of Katrina, to be insufficient to protect the city and its citizens. In the case of New Orleans, before Hurricane Katrina, the action or inaction of government and industry put the citizens of New Orleans in harm's way and resulted in the near destruction and abandonment of the city. In the aftermath of Katrina, this relationship between science, policy, and the livelihood and safety of private ordinary citizens has now become about how viable the city is and where and whether resources should be spent on communities returning or rebuilding. As I mentioned earlier, this has often resulted in a media discussion portraying this fundamental disagreement between environmental realities and the recommendations of scientists, the economic agendas of government and developers, and the welfare of individual citizens. I am interested in the question of what roles and responsibilities scientists and other experts and academics have or should have in this scenario. Svart and Van Andel in their paper discuss the idea taken from work by Guerin of quote-unquote boundary work, when scientists and stakeholders each work at the boundary between science and society. In this scenario, they say, quote, "The difference between scientific and societal statements may become less clear. On the one hand, they say, when doing some types of research, scientists state conservation ends and stress and explore societal responsibility. But then industry and government and policymakers may stress that the classic view that scientists should not behave like stakeholders, but solely as quote-unquote truth seekers. They discuss the fact that when working in these boundary areas, it often becomes unclear whether scientists are speaking as scientists, citizens, or stakeholders. Boundary work, this is a quote, "Boundary work operating at the interface of science and society can easily generate contradictions. On the one hand, it is stressed that science should contribute to important ends such as sustainability, health, welfare, economics, and justice. On the other hand, scientists are expected to work independently and in a disinterested way, the so-called scientific ethos that includes the pursuit of universal truths and a detached attitude towards society." Clearly, in this environmentally changing world, when decisions are often made using scientific research findings, we as a society need to grapple with how to disseminate the results of scientific research and how to communicate it to citizens and policymakers, and I think most importantly, how to make decisions in a very deliberate way, either based on the science or in spite of it. Policy, as I mentioned before, failed to protect fish stocks and the future viability of fishing communities. In New Orleans, did scientists fail the community by not being loud enough in warnings about what could happen? If scientists and policymakers did sufficiently educate and warn the citizens of New Orleans and coastal Louisiana, would individual citizens have in turn also been given the resources to do anything differently than they did before Katrina levee failures? How can we grapple with all of these questions? Here is one example. Researchers who model the potential future effects of climate change on weather patterns have shown that one possible scenario is that as global temperatures increase within the next 50 years, the likelihood of yearly major hurricanes on the Atlantic and the Gulf will double. This is an astounding prospect. What is the best way to warn a population of the Gulf Coast about this if people aren't already aware of it? Should scientists be focused on reporting how very vulnerable our coastal communities are, or should we focus on how to maintain our coastal communities in the face of such vulnerability, or both? What do we do if, because the history and culture of a place is so important and compelling to its residents, they choose to ignore or at least to face head-on these vulnerabilities of their city, to stay, rebuild, and see what happens next? I, for example, moved to New Orleans in 2007, and I bought a house there this past summer. And I am a coastal ecologist with access to all the information available about how vulnerable the coast is. People don't always make the decisions you think they should make based on scientific information that you give them. How do we handle this in the face of a rapidly changing environment? And how do we do this in a way that takes into consideration the social, economic, historical, and cultural realities of place? And I'm almost done. Over and over in the literature, we see recommendations for more transparent relationship between science and society. It is not always clear what this means, should be, or really can be. We will not be able to solve this problem here today, but for a start, I submit that we return again to the concept I mentioned earlier of place-based research. I stress the global nature of the questions facing New Orleans. However, one of the most important lessons we can learn from the current situation in New Orleans post-Katrina is the importance of specific cultural norms and traditions in a location and the effect they will have on the decisions people make and how they will face the prospect of a change. I suspect that individual scientists and scholars of policy historically have rarely interacted with people who live in the communities they study and make recommendations for us to the citizens who will ultimately be affected by the policy set based on, or like I said, maybe in spite of scientific evidence. If there's any conclusion I can draw from all of this, it is that as we move forward in dealing with environmental change as a society, the influence of place and how it affects people's lives and their decisions will become very important. I can recommend that our approach to dealing with societal adaptations or environmental change takes fully into consideration the social impact that place and distinct cultural characteristics of place play in the decisions people make. And one thing seems clear, that unless scientists do engage civically, the opportunity to grapple with all of these issues disappears. We need to consider new ways of carrying out research that is highly transdisciplinary and is ultimately disseminated and discussed with local communities in ways that it acknowledges the importance of